At 11:44 p.m., 3 American military positions in Iraq were doing what American military positions in active combat theaters do at 11:44 on a Tuesday night: sustaining operations. At Ain al-Assad Air Base in Anbar Province, the westernmost of the 3, a crew of 12 was completing a maintenance cycle on an MQ-9 Reaper that had returned from a 10-hour surveillance mission over the Syrian border. At Erbil International Airport in the Kurdish north, the joint operations center that coordinated American and Kurdish Peshmerga activities across the northeastern theater was staffed at its overnight minimum. 3 analysts cross-referencing the day's intelligence traffic while a duty officer managed the communications backlog. At Balad Air Base in Salah ad-Din Province, the logistics hub that moved fuel, ammunition, and personnel through the central Iraq theater was processing the last manifests of an overnight resupply flight that had arrived from Kuwait at 10:30 p.m. 3 separate facilities, 3 separate missions, 3 separate chains of command, all connected by the shared reality that they were American military presence in a country that the IRGC Aerospace Force had been targeting with increasing intensity for 3 weeks. The IRGC had been planning the simultaneous 3-base attack for 7 months. Not as a tactical operation, the individual rocket and mortar attacks that had been the IRGC's proxy instrument in Iraq for years were tactical. This was strategic in its intent. The simultaneous engagement of all 3 principal American positions in Iraq in a single compressed window was designed to achieve what no single target attack could achieve: the demonstration that American forces in Iraq had no safe location, that the geographic dispersal that was supposed to provide survivability was not survivability at all, that 300 kilometers of Iraqi territory separated by desert and mountains could be compressed into a single 4-minute engagement window by the IRGC's medium-range ballistic missile inventory. The message was not about the physical damage, though the IRGC's planners had invested considerable effort in targeting the specific infrastructure at each base whose destruction would produce the longest duration disruption. The message was about simultaneity. The message was about reach. The message was the demonstration that nowhere in Iraq was outside the envelope. The weapons assigned to the 3-base strike were organized by target complexity. Ain al-Assad, the largest facility with the most hardened infrastructure and the heaviest air defense coverage, received the largest allocation: 22 Fateh 313 precision ballistic missiles with maneuvering re-entry vehicles, targeting the fuel storage complex, the runway surface, the aircraft hardened shelters, and the radar installation that served as the base's air defense coordination node. Erbil received 11 Zulfiqar ballistic missiles aimed at the Joint Operations Center, the communications infrastructure, and the vehicle parks that sustain the base's mobility. Balad received 14 Fateh 110 missiles targeting the logistics infrastructure specifically, the fuel storage, the ammunition holding area, and the runway that made the resupply hub function. 47 ballistic missiles in total, from 3 separate launch complexes distributed across western Iran, timed to produce simultaneous terminal phase arrivals across all 3 targets within a 4-minute window. The timing precision required by the plan had demanded 3 rehearsal launches against test targets over Iranian territory. The rehearsals had been conducted. The precision had been achieved. At 11:44 p.m. and 7 seconds, 47 simultaneous ignition events bloomed on the Space Force infrared constellation's picture of western Iran, the clean, sharp thermal signatures of solid-fuel Fateh and Zulfiqar motors lighting within a 31-second window at 3 geographically separated complexes. The Space Force warning reached the Combined Air Operations Center at Al-Udeid at 11:44 p.m. and 23 seconds, 16 seconds from ignition to CAOC notification. The CAOC duty officer broadcast the alert to all 3 bases simultaneously at 11:44 p.m. and 31 seconds. al-Assad received the alert first, at 11:44 p.m. and 38 seconds, and activated its protective posture protocol within 4 seconds. Erbil's Joint Operations Center received the alert at 11:44 p.m. and 41 seconds. Balad at 11:44 p.m. and 43 seconds. The time of flight from the Iranian launch complexes to the 3 bases varied by distance and trajectory. The closest complex west of Elam province had a time of flight to al-Assad of approximately 8 minutes and 40 seconds. The northernmost complex near Tabriz had a time of flight to Erbil of approximately 7 minutes and 20 seconds. The central complex south of Tehran, assigned to the Balad strike, had a time of flight of 11 minutes and 15 seconds. The staggered times of flight were precisely what the IRGC planners had used to construct their simultaneous terminal arrival. Missiles launched earlier from the farther complexes. Missiles launched later from the closer ones, all timed to arrive within 4 minutes of each other. The CAOC received the notification at 11:44 p.m. and 23 seconds. The first missiles, the Erbil strike, launched earliest from the northernmost complex, would reach their terminal phase at approximately 11:52 p.m. and 3 seconds. The personnel at all 3 bases had approximately 7 minutes and 20 seconds from alert to first impact. 7 minutes and 20 seconds. Enough time for a well-rehearsed crew to reach hardened shelter. Enough time for protective protocols to transfer critical system functions to backup nodes. Not enough time to intercept 47 maneuvering ballistic missiles with no pre-positioned defense assets. The pre-positioned defense assets were already there. 14 days before the strike, the theater ballistic missile defense architecture in Iraq had been augmented. Not announced, not publicized, conducted under the operational security procedures that govern major asset movements in an active conflict theater. 3 additional Patriot PAC-3 MSE batteries had been forward deployed from their storage positions at al-Udaid to positions covering all 3 Iraqi bases. 1 battery at a position west of Anbar covering al-Assad's western approach corridor. 1 battery north of Kirkuk covering the Erbil approach arc from Iran, and 1 battery central to Salah ad-Din covering the Balad approach from the east. The deployments had been triggered by a signals intelligence assessment that had, 14 days before the strike, detected a pattern of IRGC Aerospace Force communications traffic consistent with a multiple simultaneous target strike planning process. The assessment had not identified the specific targets, the specific timing, or the specific weapons. It had identified the pattern with enough confidence to justify the defensive repositioning as a precautionary measure. The precautionary measure was now the difference between 47 maneuvering ballistic missiles arriving against defended positions and arriving against undefended ones. The THAAD battery that had been positioned south of Erbil since the beginning of the conflict's 2nd week, positioned there because the intelligence assessment had consistently rated Erbil as the highest priority target for the IRGC in northern Iraq, acquired the 11 Zulfiqar missiles assigned to Erbil at 11:48 p.m., 4 minutes after launch, as they reached their mid-course phase above 40 miles altitude. The THAAD's engagement geometry against a Zulfiqar in the mid-course phase is close to optimal. The missile's flight profile at this range and trajectory gives the kill vehicle a favorable intercept geometry with sufficient timeline for terminal guidance correction. The THAAD battery fired 8 kill vehicles between 11:48 p.m. and 11:50 p.m. against the 11 Zulfiqar missiles. 7 confirmed intercepts. 4 missiles survived the THAAD mid-course engagement and continued their descent toward Erbil, activating their maneuvering re-entry vehicle guidance at 11 miles altitude. The Patriot PAC-3 MSE battery north of Kirkuk took the 4 survivors. 3 were intercepted in the upper terminal phase between 11:51 p.m. and 11:51 p.m. and 40 seconds. The 4th executed a terminal maneuver that displaced its trajectory laterally. by approximately 300 meters, the maximum lateral correction the Zulfiqar's guidance could achieve, and survived the first PAC-3 MSE engagement attempt when the interceptor's kill vehicle passed through the target's projected position a fraction of a second before the maneuver completed. The battery's shoot-shoot reserve, a second PAC-3 MSE held for exactly this contingency, was fired at 11:51 p.m. and 44 seconds. Intercept was confirmed at 11:51 p.m. and 51 seconds at an altitude of 14,000 feet above the Erbil plains. The debris from the intercepted Zulfiqar warhead fell in an uninhabited agricultural area 8 miles northeast of the airport. The Joint Operations Center was untouched. The al-Assad engagement was the most demanding of the three, both because of the size of the incoming salvo and because the Fateh 313's maneuvering re-entry vehicle was more capable than the Zulfiqar's. The Patriot battery west of Anbar had been positioned with its engagement geometry specifically optimized for the western approach corridor, the arc from which missiles fired from the Elam province complex would approach al-Assad. The battery's radar acquired all 22 Fateh 313 re-entry vehicles as they descended into the terminal phase engagement zone beginning at 11:53 p.m. The battery fired in priority sequence, beginning with the missiles on the most direct trajectories to the runway and fuel storage, then working through the remaining target-designated vehicles. Shoot-shoot doctrine for all 22. 44 PAC-3 MSE interceptors committed in a window of 97 seconds. The battery had been loaded to capacity before the deployment. It would not be loaded to capacity after this engagement. 19 of the 22 Fateh 313 missiles were intercepted. 3 survived. The surviving 3 were the Fateh 313s that had been positioned at the trailing edge of the salvo. The missiles launched last, arriving last, whose approach timing placed them in the engagement window after the battery had expended the majority of its allocated interceptors and was working from its reserve. The 3 survivors impacted al-Assad between 11:54 p.m. and 11:55 p.m. The first impacted the eastern edge of the runway, producing a crater that closed the runway surface for 41 hours until repair crews filled and resurfaced it. The second impacted the outer perimeter of the aircraft hardened shelters, detonating against the blast wall of Shelter 7, an unoccupied shelter whose aircraft had been repositioned to back up dispersal areas when the protective posture protocol activated 11 minutes before impact. The warhead's penetrating variant transferred enough energy through the shelter's wall to crack the reinforced concrete on the blast-facing side. The shelter was assessed as damaged but repairable within 72 hours. The third Fateh 313 impacted the fuel storage compound's outer berm, the hardened earthwork that the facility's engineer had designed in the facility's post-2020 hardening program to absorb exactly this category of impact and prevent propagation to the fuel tanks themselves. The berm performed as designed. The fuel tank farm was intact. The fuel was intact. The operations sustained by that fuel continued. The Balad engagement was the most technically precise of the 3. The 14 Fateh 110 missiles assigned to the logistics hub had been targeted with the specific intent of destroying the base's ability to function as a resupply node. The planners had selected aim points that, if all 14 impacted accurately, would have closed Balad to airlift operations and destroyed the fuel and ammunition reserves that made it logistically relevant. The Patriot battery in central Salah ad-Din province acquired the 14 Fateh 110 missiles at 11:53 p.m. in their terminal descent. The Fateh 110 is less maneuverable in its terminal phase than the Fateh 313, an older airframe with a guidance package that was designed for accuracy but not for the anti-intercept maneuvering that the newer variants incorporated. Against PAC-3 MSE in shoot-once mode, single interceptor per target, accepted against the less capable threat, the engagement probability was high. 12 of the 14 Fateh 110 missiles were intercepted between 11:53 p.m. and 11:54 p.m. and 40 seconds. 2 survived. The 2 surviving Fateh 110 missiles impacted Balad at 11:55 p.m. The first impacted the logistics compound's vehicle park, destroying 4 heavy logistics trucks and damaging 3 more. The second impacted the edge of the runway threshold, producing a surface deformation that required 16 hours of repair before the runway could accept the weight of fully loaded cargo aircraft. The resupply flight that had arrived at 10:30 p.m. was unloaded and complete. Its replacement, scheduled for 6 a.m., was delayed by 16 hours. 16 hours of logistics delay in a theater that moved thousands of tons of material per day was an operational inconvenience, not a strategic disruption. The IRGC's targeting of Balad had been designed to impose a 72-hour closure. It had achieved 16 hours. Of the 47 ballistic missiles launched against 3 American bases in Iraq, 41 had been intercepted. 6 had impacted. None of the 6 had achieved their designed effect. The runway at al-Assad was closed for 41 hours, not the projected 72. The shelter was repairable in 72 hours. The fuel storage was intact. The Erbil operations center was intact. The Balad runway was closed for 16 hours. No American personnel at any of the 3 bases had been killed or seriously injured. The protective posture protocols had moved every exposed person to hardened shelter before the first missile arrived. Every base was operationally degraded in specific and repairable ways. None had been operationally closed. The response was designated Operation Hammer Strike. The targeting package for Hammer Strike had 3 components. The first was the 3 IRGC Aerospace Force launch complexes that had fired the 47 missiles. The complexes in Elam province, near Tabriz and south of Tehran. The Space Force infrared constellation had tracked all 3 from the moment of launch, maintaining continuous observation of the launch vehicles and support infrastructure through the engagement. The second component was the IRGC Aerospace Force's Iraq-focused command and coordination network, the forward command posts in Iranian territory near the Iraqi border that had coordinated the strike timing and provided targeting updates to the launch crews. The signals intelligence facilities whose collection against American bases in Iraq had provided the targeting data for the strike plan, and the logistics nodes that sustained the Iraq-focused strike element. The third component was the IRGC's ballistic missile production support infrastructure, the propellant mixing and casting facilities that produced the solid fuel for the Fateh and Zulfagar families, whose capacity was finite and whose destruction would impose a measurable delay on the IRGC's ability to reconstitute the expended salvo. The B-1B Lancers had been airborne from their forward operating location since 11 p.m., 44 minutes before the IRGC launch, on a pre-deployment posture that the intelligence assessment's warning indicators had justified. 6 B-1Bs, each carrying 24 Jabwe JASSMER cruise missiles, had been holding in an orbit pattern over the northern Arabian Sea. At 11:47 p.m., 3 minutes after the launch was detected, the B-1Bs received their weapons employment authorization and turned toward their release lines. Their JASSM-ER cruise missiles would be released at 12:11 a.m. and would arrive on their targets between 12:41 a.m. and 12:58 a.m. Simultaneous arrivals across all 3 launch complexes and the command and coordination network in a 30-second time-on-target window that left the IRGC's personnel and equipment no gap between the first impact and the last. The F-35A package from 2 operating locations, Prince Sultan in Saudi Arabia and Al Dhafra in the UAE, launched at 11:52 p.m., 8 minutes after the IRGC launch, and were assigned to the forward command posts and the signals intelligence facilities near the Iraqi border. These targets were closer than the Elam and Tabriz complexes and required a faster response to catch the personnel and equipment before they could be evacuated or dispersed. The F-35As, using their low observable profiles to operate without Growler escort against the degraded Iranian air defense network, carried GBU-39, small diameter bombs configured for anti-personnel and light structure effect against the command posts, and GBU-31 JDAMs against the hardened equipment shelters at the signals intelligence facilities. The EA-18G Growlers that provided the jamming envelope over the border region had been airborne since 11:55 p.m. The F-35A package crossed into Iranian airspace at 12:09 a.m. and began its weapons employment sequence at 12:14 a.m., addressing 10 aim points across 4 locations in a 14-minute engagement window that concluded at 12:28 a.m. The propellant production facilities were addressed by a dedicated B-2A Spirit strike. 1 aircraft, 2 targets, 4 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators assigned to the 2 mixing and casting facilities that intelligence had identified as the primary production nodes for the Fateh 110 family solid propellant. The GBU-57 at these targets was not being used for its penetration capability. The propellant facilities were not deeply buried. It was being used for its physical size and its large lethal radius against the specialized industrial equipment that propellant production requires: the Sigma blade mixers, the casting press machinery, the cure chambers. Industrial equipment of this type is precisely engineered, expensive, and cannot be improvised or quickly replaced. The 2 facilities received their GBU-57 impacts at 12:44 a.m. and 12:46 a.m. The seismic signatures were small, 1.4 and 1.6 magnitude, consistent with surface-level detonations of large conventional warheads rather than deep penetrations. The thermal signatures on Space Force infrared, however, were large and sustained, consistent with the ignition of residual solid propellant stored in the facility's curing inventory. The fires burned for 11 hours. The production equipment was assessed as non-recoverable without replacement programs sourced from foreign suppliers. Suppliers who were, at this point in the conflict, under significant international pressure not to provide material support to the IRGC's missile program. At 1:03 a.m., the Hammer Strike post-strike preliminary assessment was transmitted to the CAOC at Al-Udeid. The assessment covered the full target set. All 3 launch complexes struck with confirmed impact on primary infrastructure. All 4 command and coordination nodes addressed. Both propellant production facilities assessed as non-recoverable. All launch vehicles tracked and addressed. The 47 missiles that had been expended against 3 American bases in Iraq had been answered by a strike that reduced the IRGC Aerospace Force's Iraq-focused strike capacity, the specific element that had been built and maintained for the Iraq theater, to a fraction of its pre-strike state in the time it takes to make a round trip from the Arabian Sea to western Iran and back. At Ain al-Assad, the runway repair team had begun filling the crater at 12:15 a.m., working under blackout conditions with the equipment that the base kept specifically for battle damage repair of airfield surfaces. The estimated 41-hour closure was recalculated at 1:30 a.m. to 33 hours based on the actual damage assessment and the available repair resources. At Erbil, the Joint Operations Center had never interrupted its analytical work. The duty officer had moved the watch team to the hardened shelter at 11:44 p.m., continued running operations from the shelter's communications terminal during the engagement, and had restored the team to the primary operations center at 11:58 p.m., 7 minutes after the last missile had been intercepted. At Balad, the runway repair team had assessed the threshold deformation and estimated a 16-hour closure, confirmed at 12:45 a.m. The 6 a.m. resupply flight was notified of the delay at 12:50 a.m. and rescheduled for 10 a.m. The IRGC had fired 47 of its most accurate ballistic missiles in the most precisely timed coordinated strike it had ever attempted against American bases in Iraq. The physical result was a closed runway at one base, a damaged shelter that no longer contained an aircraft, and a 16-hour logistics delay at a resupply hub. The operational result was that 3 American military positions in Iraq were functioning, staffed, and conducting operations within 11 hours of the attack. The strategic message that the attack was supposed to send, that no location in Iraq was safe, that American military presence in Iraq could be rendered inoperable from across the Iranian border, had not been sent. A different message had been sent instead, that a coordinated 47 missile strike at 3 simultaneous targets, the product of 7 months of planning and the expenditure of a significant fraction of the IRGC Aerospace Force's precision missile inventory in the Iraq theater, had achieved runway closures measured in hours and a logistics delay measured in hours. And that the infrastructure that had made the strike possible, the launch complexes, the command nodes, the propellant production facilities, was gone. The pre-dawn sky over the Iraqi desert was the same sky it had been at 11:44 p.m. The stars were the same. The 3 bases were still there, operating in their various states of repair with the methodical efficiency of military installations that have absorbed a blow and are getting back to work because the work does not stop. The IRGC had tried to demonstrate that Iraqi territory was not safe for American forces. American forces were still in Iraqi territory, still operating, still present.
In the arithmetic of strategic messaging, the reply always costs more than the message.